Hello, everyone. Welcome to this K4DD webinar on aid priorities in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. My name is Peter Taylor. I'm the director of the Knowledge for Development and Diplomacy program, and I'm a professorial research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies here in the UK. And I have the privilege to be chairing the session, which promises to be excellent given the amazing group of speakers that we have joining us today. So just to say a quick word about K4DD, the Knowledge for Development and Diplomacy Programme, supported by the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, which provides evidence and learning to improve the impact of development and diplomacy policy and programmes. And it offers a range of knowledge and learning services. There's a great deal of information on an array of development diplomacy topics on the website. And we'll put the link in the chat, but that is www.k4d.ids.ac.uk. This conversation today is really important because, as we've said in the blurb on the website, by 2030, the vast majority of the world's extreme poor are projected to live in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. And today we're really going to explore the growing importance of these contexts, particularly for global development and stability. And we have a really fantastic panel of experts who I will introduce very shortly. They're going to really examine, drawing on their own experience and different contexts, what the evidence shows about the record of humanitarian and development assistance, including the persistent challenges of delivering aid effectively in these environments. And we'll be hearing about the kinds of tensions that donors face in prioritization, where to direct aid, the practical difficulties of operating in very complex and uncertain contexts. And the central theme will also be how to support country ownership in contexts where institutions are contested or fragile. And this conversation is set against the backdrop of a much wider set of conversations which are happening really right now about the future of international development cooperation and how to find ways forward which are more effective but also more inclusive and more oriented around the agendas and the needs and priorities of those within those contexts where the delivery of aid is taking place. So we have a really fantastic group of speakers who are each going to share their experience for about 10 minutes each. And at the end, we will be opening up for Q&A. If you have questions as we go, please put questions in the chat. We have a Q&A too, but the chat is always a very good way to do it. And we'll try to ensure that at the end there is an opportunity for a conversation. So today we are joined by 6 speakers. Professor Rachel Gisselquist, Professor in Governance and Development and Director of GSDRC, University of Birmingham. Rachel, I'll let you explain what the acronym means in just a moment. Dr. Ifat Idris, a Research Fellow with K4DD, also GSDRC at the University of Birmingham. Mr. Habib Maya, Deputy Secretary General of G7+. Mr. Vitaly Mekha, Executive Director, Reality of Aid Africa, and former non-executive co-chair of the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation. Professor Christopher Zurcher, Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa, and Mr. Ranil Dissanayake, Deputy Chief Economist, Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. So, as you will hear shortly, we have a fantastic group of speakers who are going to really draw on their wealth of experience. And if you have questions, we hope to have a lively and engaged conversation at the end. So without further ado, Rachel, let me pass to you first.
Hi, good afternoon. I am speaking from my phone because we've had some technical difficulties. So if I look a little close to you here, that's the reason, but hopefully you can hear me okay. It's really nice to be here, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion. I wanted to sort of structure my initial remarks around 3 areas. So first, I think it's important to step back a bit from the core question at hand and to ask a prior question of why we provide, or why countries do and should provide aid and engage in development cooperation at all. If I were participating in a panel on this topic 2 years ago, I might not have started at this point, because a starting assumption in a lot of my work has been that there is, a shared understanding and recognition of the value of aid and development cooperation. And so the project for myself as a researcher has been to understand how to make it more effective. But I think it's become really abundantly clear, certainly since January 2025, and arguably before as well, that this sort of what I've seen as a shared understanding and recognition perhaps isn't so broadly shared. And so there is some value in setting out a case for aid. And I think that case has two core components. So one component has to do with the reasons for providing aid, the objectives to be met. And there are, on the one hand, humanitarian objectives and contributing to poverty reduction, promoting well-being, supporting economic development in poorer countries. And on the other hand, there are also national interest objectives, clearly, in many cases. So helping to reduce instability and conflict, and prevent or address potential cross-border risks in terms of, say, terrorism and forced migration that might have implications for security and stability at home among donor countries, and also more broadly helping to support and promote values in among like-minded actors abroad. So building sort of soft power, if you will, in this way. So I think countries do and they should provide aid, both because it's right and because it's strategically wise. And this is especially so, arguably, in fragile and conflicted affected states. So we've heard the humanitarian needs in many fragile contexts are very clear. And there are also clear national interests for engaging in development cooperation in these contexts. This is not only in terms of security, but also, I think, in the effective management of risks and hazards that might spread across borders. And I think the recent Ebola outbreak in DRC and Uganda is just one example here. The second component of the case for aid has to do with aid effectiveness. And there's been a lot of discussion about aid effectiveness. It might seem obvious that aid works in some sense to achieve what it sets out to do, but there's a lot of debate on this point. And certainly there have been a number of important critiques raised about this. But I think, my reading, and we can go back to this in the discussion a bit, is that the best available evidence suggests that aid doesn't always work, but it certainly has the potential to help. We don't have to be naive about aid effectiveness to think that it can help, and it can in some cases help significantly in addressing humanitarian and developmental gaps in particular. There are a number of examples of this. South Korea is a striking example. It's gone from being an incredibly poor, low-income country after the Korean War to a high-income country and a member of the OECD Development Assistance Committee. A second point, then turning specifically to aid in fragile and conflicted affected contexts. It's very clear that there is a much more mixed record of aid effectiveness in these contexts. And we know a lot about what makes aid effective, and knowing that, it's not that surprising that it's particularly challenging in these contexts to deliver and to participate in effective development cooperation. And country ownership is a key factor here. So we know that almost by definition, fragile contexts are contexts with deep political divisions, political and social divisions, where political settlements may be unstable, some groups may be excluded, governments and state institutions may lack legitimacy, and state capacity may be weak. And so, this is really a challenge when we know that country ownership is important for delivering effective development assistance. So this was the starting point in a book that I edited last year with colleagues Patricia Justino and Andrea Vaccaro. Christoph contributed to it. It brought together, I think, a really excellent set of contributions exploring these topics. And we set out some of the possible ways forward in thinking about what to do with this challenge around country ownership. A third point, sorry, I'm not seeing some of the notes. So if I'm going over, please just wave at me, Peter.
I will. You're okay for another couple of minutes, Rachel.
Okay, yeah. So I think a related question here, there's often the question in fragile contexts about whether we should intervene and where we should intervene. But a related question is in which areas or sectors to concentrate assistance. And on this, there's been quite a lot of attention recently to assistance for basic service delivery, especially in health, education, and social protection. And I think that at least my reading of the emerging evidence is that there is a lot of space to link this to broader state building and institution building efforts. And this was a point that I think comes out very nicely in a synthesis report commissioned by the FCDO that came out a few months ago called Joining the Dots. And it's put together by Becky Carter, Paul Harvey, and my colleague here at Birmingham, Claire McLaughlin. So finally, third, all of this discussion is taking place in a rapidly changing aid environment. So we've seen aid budgets slashed from one day to the next, which is hugely challenging for actors in aid recipient countries. There's renewed emphasis on national security and national interests. There are new donors, much more attention to South-South cooperation. And I think these changes are hugely important. We're reflecting on them in ongoing work at my center, the Governance and Social Development Resource Center, GSDRC, at the University of Birmingham, in collaboration with the United Nations University in a project on the future of aid. But I think even as things change dramatically, some of the challenges remain the same, particularly in terms of how to think about country ownership and how to address that challenge. And so I think there is still quite a lot of learning that can be had in sharing and learning systematically from experiences in past projects and programs about how to address this. Thank you. Let me stop there.
Thanks so much, Rachel, and it came through loud and clear, which was perfect. And thanks also for situating this conversation in that bigger picture, because there certainly are many dialogues and engagements going on right now around where development cooperation is going and what the future looks like. And of course, this whole question of how to engage in fragile and conflict-affected states in particular is a really important dimension of that. And of course, it's not only funders and development actors who are interested in this whole question, but citizens of many countries as well are really questioning as well about the effectiveness of aid. So thank you for giving us that bigger that picture as well. Pat, let me turn to you, if I may, and I think you have some slides to share for us.
Hi everyone, my name is Ifat. I'm a research fellow with the K4DD program. I have a presentation which Ben is going to put on, so I'm going to turn my camera off because then you can see the slides. Right, okay, so the first slide please, Ben. Thank you. So K4DD, over the years we've done a lot of research on fragile states. Today I'm going to present the findings of two of the reports which we did, which looked at service delivery and the role of donors. I just want to start by making the point that obviously fragility is an incredibly complex and difficult issue, and it has lots of different facets to it. If you want to address fragility in the long term, you have to improve governance, rule of law, ensure security, those kinds of aspects as well. But today I'm going to focus on the narrower issue of how can you effectively deliver services in those contexts, and obviously how can service delivery contribute to building state capacity. Next slide, please. So just a brief note on what we actually mean by fragility, the state fragility. There isn't really a consensus on the definition, but it's useful to think about it through three dimensions: a failure of authority on the part of the state, a failure of service delivery, and a failure of legitimacy. And of course, the three of these are all mutually reinforcing in a sort of vicious cycle. Next slide, please. So as Peter mentioned and Rachel mentioned at the beginning, the issue of state fragility is no longer a marginal development issue. It really is mainstream, huge. 2 billion people already living in those contexts, and these numbers are rising. And yet service delivery in those contexts is extraordinarily difficult because of they don't have the facilities, the infrastructure, they don't have the personnel, they don't have the capacity. So and also, of course, often you're going to have either conflict or situations of ongoing violence as well. So in those circumstances, it becomes very, very difficult. And yet, at the same time, if governments can't deliver services, that further undermines their legitimacy and therefore further contributes to state fragility. And therefore, it's really important to ensure systems can get basic services, both because of human development outcomes to meet their needs, but also in terms of building the state. Right, next slide, please. So this brings us to, the key dilemma for donors, which is what should they prioritize? You're working in a context where, state systems are really weak. So should donors prioritize delivering services often through non-state routes, such as NGOs, or should they focus on strengthening state systems and state institutions, or is it possible for them to do both? And that's a real challenge, but how can you achieve both of these objectives simultaneously? Next slide, please. Just one point before I turn to sort of, potentially what could be done and what is being done, which is just to stress that obviously there are lots of issues which stem from fragile states themselves, but there are also issues that stem from donors and from the way in which they work in fragile states. And for example, often, aid to fragile states will be insufficient. It won't be predictable. It's concentrated in a few states. There's a lack of coordination between donors. And also donors, of course, are very risk averse. So lots of fragile states, they won't work in at all, and others, they won't have a presence on the ground. So all of those factors do contribute to making the situation even more difficult. And therefore, the challenge is not just for fragile states and how they can be improved, but also donors need to look at themselves and see how they can improve and be more effective in the way in which they engage. Right, next slide, please. So turning to, what are the different approaches that are being taken right now? There's a whole range of the evidence which we reviewed found that there are a whole range of different approaches which are being taken, from sort of government delivery to contracting out to NGOs, community-based approaches, partnerships with government and non-state, and also just market-based private sector provision. And it's important to stress that these aren't completely distinct, discrete approaches, but really they form together, they form part of a continuum, and which approach is taken will really depend on the context, and it will depend on what is there in terms of what is the state actually able to do. Is there a state? Are there institutions there? What kind of capacity do they have? And that's your starting point for then deciding, well, where are the gaps and how can those best be filled? Next slide, please. So in the, I would encourage you to read the report. There are two reports. The first one looks at the different, this particular issue about what are the different approaches being taken to deliver services. And there are a whole range of different examples which are given in there, which cover both different sectors like health, education, water, sanitation, but also a whole range of different contexts as well. I'm just going to focus on the first example given here, which is that of Gaza. Following the Hamas attacks in October 2024 and the subsequent war, basically Gaza's health infrastructure was completely decimated, and as a result of that, Gaza saw the first polio case in almost 25 years, and that obviously was a huge source of concern for everyone because it's something that affects everyone. And the UN was able to negotiate with the Israelis to secure a number of humanitarian pauses, and during those pauses they made use of whatever local health workers were there and also any outreach workers. And the key thing was that they reached children where they were. So not whatever health facilities remained, but also they were going out to food distribution points, to water points, to transit routes as well to reach kids. And it was incredibly effective. Tens of thousands of children were vaccinated through this approach. And it's an example of how you can achieve results, but you have to be sort of really adaptable and flexible and work with whatever local capacity is there. Right, next slide, please. So these, the next two slides really kind of sum up the findings in terms of having looked at, a whole range of approaches and recommendations from different donors and other think tanks. These are sort of the crux of the recommendations which came out. And the first one, the key one, which really emerged was that, the most important thing is to deliver services to people. And, what counts is how those services are delivered. Are they transparent? Are they responsive to people's needs? Are they inclusive? That is the key issue. Who delivers those services, whether it's state or non-state, is really a secondary issue. But obviously, if people are able to get services, that will ultimately contribute to building state legitimacy. And being realistic in these settings, often the most, the most feasible option will be using non-state actors, either using NGOs or using sort of international agencies. But what that means, it's still really, really important to involve the state. And it could be, just engaging in including the state in simply in a planning role or in a regulatory role or in monitoring. But it is important, even if using non-state actors, to still include the state. At the same time, obviously, whatever interventions are carried out, they need to be context specific, because fragile states vary hugely in terms of the challenges which they face and whatever is available there, and therefore you have to be context specific. And that in turn, next slide please, requires donors to be really good at sort of political economy analysis, and also to be really flexible and adaptive in their programming. This comes to the final point I want to make here, which is really relevant for the current situation which we're in, and Rachel referred to this in her remarks as well, which is that donors can come under really strong pressure from their own populations to cut these programs and to cut funding. And why is it important? And we're seeing that obviously right now in the US and even here in the UK as well. And I think it's withdrawal is not an option for donors. They have to stay engaged. It's important for security reasons. It's important for ethical reasons. It's important for humanitarian reasons, and therefore that means that donors really, as well as focusing on how do we work in these states and what can we do effectively there, they also need to think about communicating effectively with their own populations and making that case about why this is so important. Next slide, please. Right, the final two slides, I'm not going to spend too much time on these. These are really, if you look at the reports, there are also a number of sort of sector-specific recommendations within those for healthcare, for education, and the next slide is about water and sanitation. And really the key point that emerges from all of them is that, you have to sort of build on whatever systems are there, whether it's, and you will often have to use non-state routes as well. But at the same time, it's really important to try always to think long term and think about while delivering services through NGOs or whatever, how can we also at the same time build state capacity, and how can we build sustainable systems that can carry on working in the long term. So that's really what I want to say. I just want to come back to the point which I made right at the beginning, which is that the issue isn't really about should donors focus on delivering services through whatever non-state routes are available, or should they focus on building the state? It's not really an either or. It's a question of you have to do both, and you have to find ways in which to do both. And even if you are using a non-state route, which you often will have to do at the same time, always keep in mind that you need to build state capacity as well, and also just be pragmatic about the approaches that are taken. Look at what the situation is and be flexible and adaptive. Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks. That's great. And if anyone is interested in the reports that I just talked about, Ben has kindly put the links in the chat. So please do take a look there, and you will be able to access more information. I think too there might be interest in the possibility of having a copy of your slides, so if that's possible, I think that would probably be appreciated as well. So thank you very much indeed for that. Mr. Habib Maya, may I turn to you, please? Next.
Thank you, Peter. First of all, a greeting from the G7 Plus Secretariat.
Habib, I hope you can hear me. Yes.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can now. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Peter. First of all, it's an honor to join you today on behalf of the G7 Plus for this very critical discussion. Before addressing how donors should engage, we must acknowledge the structural shortcomings that we face or have faced in managing international aid in conflict-affected contexts or countries. Based on the collective experiences of the G7 Plus countries, I want to outline three major challenges that served as the backdrop for the establishment of the G7 Plus group. First, international aid has too often been driven by political economy and security agenda of donor nations rather than a genuine vision for long-term stability and self-reliance in recipient countries. This is a point that Rachel also alluded to. From a realist perspective of international relations, this national interest-centric behavior may be the norm. However, it comes at a staggering dilemma of perpetual cycle of fragility and poverty for the world's 1.5 billion people. If aid is really guided by principle of international solidarity, aid flows must match the urgent needs of recipient countries, not the strategic alignment of donors. Such misaligned priorities have also consistently undermined countries' ownership, enhanced state-building efforts. We have lived this sad reality in Afghanistan, my own country, where 2 decades of international engagement ended up the country to where it had started from. Second, while the roots of state fragility often trace back to decades of conflict crises, the fragility trap is worsened because state formation and institution stability are rarely given the patience or space to succeed. The prevailing narrative assumes that service delivery is the permanent responsibility of aid providers rather than the state. This creates a deeply counterproductive paradox. A lack of donor trust in state institutions leads to parallel systems, each functioning independently, bypassing national state institutions that it claims to strengthen. Such mechanisms of aid delivery did not only hollow out the minimum capacity the state could have, but also weaken the legitimacy of the state institution. Third, many fragile contexts host dozens of donor missions, each operating with conflicting mandate, separate reporting requirements, and distinct priorities. Furthermore, peace-building humanitarian development agencies rarely coordinate their efforts, even within the same donor country. I was glad to hear this from Ifat as well. In contexts like Afghanistan and Iraq, an additional layer of military actors pursued short-term aid programs to win the hearts and minds of people. This fragmentation undercuts long-term stability. When aid bypasses national market, it's not only undermines local economic development, but also weakens the very foundation of the long-term stability and resilience that development assistance is intended to support. Now, against this backdrop, the G7 Plus established what we call the New Deal for Engagement in Fragile States, which I will not go into detail. I will definitely welcome all the viewers to look for it. But what it aims is to shift the paradigm through 3 core pillars. First, commitment to supporting inclusive political security, justice, economic foundation, and revenues. Second, a commitment to new ways of engagement based on country-led pathways out of fragility. And third, a commitment to transparent, predictable aid using harmonized country matured financial systems. Despite the promising prospect of the success of these principles that emerged from the experiences of countries, the realization of the New Deal was reduced to a mere technocratic practices. Today, after 15 years of agreeing on the New Deal principles, the current global dynamics further complicate our path forward. We are forced to confront 2 stark opposing realities. First, the projection that by 2030, up to 2/3 of world's extreme poor will be living in fragile and conflict-affected situations was once viewed a pessimistic forecast only a few years ago. However, since the onslaught of the COVID-19 followed by intensification of geopolitical rivalries, this projection is almost our current reality. Second, what we call the Great AIDS Recession. Paradoxically, as needs skyrocket, we are experiencing a sharp reduction in official development assistance from major traditional donors like the United States, Germany, and many more. While empirical academic debate on aid effectiveness remain mixed, aid has undoubtedly served as a lifeline for millions in countries like South Sudan, DRC, Haiti, Yemen, Afghanistan, and etc. On the top of this, great power rivalries are also directly and indirectly affecting conflict-affected countries. These countries are uniquely vulnerable to proxy conflicts and paradoxically to predatory external behavior, frequently centered around extraction of abundant critical minerals that these countries host. This brings me to my last part of my points. In response to this multifaceted crisis, the G7 Plus has adopted a proactive framework. First, as we all know that conflict is the primary driver of poverty in conflict-affected countries. We cannot address economic distress without stopping the violence. And therefore, in our recent ministerial meeting in Delhi, Timor-Leste, member countries committed to strengthening our Eminent Person Council, explicitly mandated to facilitate peer-to-peer mediation, truth-telling, and national reconciliation. Second, to foster economic resilience, the G7+ has established a Rapid Response Advisory Center. As most of you know, that most conflict-affected countries are extraordinarily rich in natural resources, capable of transforming development. However, facing urgent fiscal crisis and severe technical capacity gaps, these countries are frequently pushed into hasty, asymmetric contracts with multinational companies. When these flawed resource sharing agreements are realized, countries face devastating international legal arbitration. Our advisory center equipped member states with the timely legal and negotiation capacity to secure fair contracts, ensuring that natural wealth benefits the citizens rather than their corporate bottom lines. 3, many countries in fragile situations are trapped by what we call the systematic debt inherited from the past regimes, or in case like Haiti, deep historical and colonial legacies. Today, vulnerable low-income countries spend over $100 billion annually on external debt servicing. Amidst rising global interest rates, these numbers are soaring. We are seeking to take these debates to G20, the big G7, and also the international financial institutions to demand debt relief and innovative debt to development swaps. Resources must be spent on serving the urgent priorities of the current generation, not servicing the debt of the past. 4, we must fundamentally confront the prevailing international narrative on fragility. This is an important point that I think the speaker also alluded to in the beginning. The current framework is paralyzing risk-averse, treating engagement purely as risk management exercises. These fears prevent aid from trickling down into the local economies. We must pivot to a narrative built on potential. Conflict-affected countries possess immense potential for resilience, for self-reliance, and also stability. In an era of reduced global aid, international donors must view their investment not as charity to a broken system, but as a catalytic capital for countries' latent potential. In conclusion, I just would like to remind that the path to 2030 requires a profound departure from business as usual aid management. In order to reverse the projection stated in the preamble of the question that was posed to us, we need to adopt a multifaceted yet harmonized approach that is far-sighted rather than short-lived and reactive. We have enough lessons from the past that can guide us through this distressing time, and the G7+ group is willing and committed to inform the reforms in the international aid system using its collective experiences. I thank you for your attention. I'll be happy to take any question.
Thank you so much, Habib. Some really profound comments, and I think many of the things that you've just shared are also issues which are arising in some of the global dialogues which are taking place. I think one of the observations that's come through many of those is that you raise the example of the New Deal and how those principles exist. Unfortunately, many of those principles have just never been adhered to, and now we're at a situation where the urgency for action is absolutely critical. And I think that's one of the big questions, is how do we move from more principles and more aspirations actually to acting on those and bringing about real change. So thank you so much for sharing those experiences. Just encourage anyone that may have questions to put them in the Q&A, and at the end we'll be sure to try to get to those. May I now turn to Vitalis Mecha for your input.
Thank you very much, and let me begin by congratulating the organizers for this very important and timely session. I would like to begin with a very simple observation. By 2030, most of the world's extreme poor are expected to live in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. Yet these are precisely the contexts where the international development system is least willing to apply its own principles. That should concern us all. For more than a decade, we have spoken about country ownership, alignment, mutual accountability, and development effectiveness. We have built frameworks, indicators, and monitoring systems around these principles. The Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation has repeatedly reaffirmed them. Yet, when we examine what happens in fragile contexts and conflict-affected contexts, a different reality emerges. The more fragile a country becomes, the less ownership it is permitted to exercise. The more conflict intensifies, the more decisions are transferred away from national institutions and political processes. The more urgent the need, the greater the tendency to bypass the very systems that development cooperation claims to be strengthening. This contradiction sits at the center of the fragility context debate. And it forces us to ask ourselves a very difficult question. Do we genuinely believe that in country ownership, or do we believe in country ownership only when countries make decisions that align with donor preferences? Because fragile contexts expose this tension more clearly than anything else. Take, for example, Somalia. For years, development partners have invested heavily in coordination mechanisms, compacts, and partnership frameworks. Yet, the dominant response to risk has remained the creation of parallel implementation arrangements and external management systems. In Sudan, justification for bypassing national systems is understandable. The governance challenges there are real. Conflicts there is real as well as issues to do with corruption. But after more than a decade, we should ask ourselves an uncomfortable question as well. If institutions remain too weak to trust after years of intervention, what exactly has the international community been building and strengthening over that period of time? Weak institutions have become, to us, more of a justification for intervention and the justification to continue external control. The result for us is really self-reinforcing cycle. Fragility justifies bypassing ownership weakens institutions, and weak institutions then become evidence that ownership remains impossible. This cycle has become one of the defining features of development cooperation in fragile contexts. And yet, we continue to frame fragility primarily as a problem of partner countries. Partners, perhaps we should spend more time examining the fragilities of the aid system itself. It is short-term funding cycle, it's fragmented projects, its risk aversion, its tendency to privilege upward accountability to donor over downward accountability to citizens. It's an ability to tolerate political processes that they cannot fully control. This brings me to another question. Conventional framing is that donors face a difficult trade-off between responding to the need and managing risks. I'm not convinced that this captures the real issue. The real issue is that aid allocation is never driven by need alone. If need determined allocation, many fragile contexts would receive dramatically different levels and forms of support than they currently do. Aid is shaped by security concerns. It is also shaped by migration politics, as well as strategic interests. This is not a criticism of any particular donor. It is a description of how power operates within the international system. The problem arises when we pretend otherwise, because once we acknowledge that aid is shaped by interests as well as needs, we can then begin to have a more honest conversation about ownership. And ownership is where I believe we must really focus on. Personally, I find the recent shift towards the new language or new narrative around inclusive ownership being a bit puzzling. Inclusive ownership sounds attractive. Everyone is included. Everyone has a seat on the table. Everyone is consulted. But inclusion is not the same thing as power. A room can be inclusive while decisions remain concentrated elsewhere. as in many countries in the fragile context. What fragile contexts need is not more inclusive ownership. They need democratic ownership. The central question is not whether every stakeholder is represented. The central question is whether citizens have meaningful influence over decisions that shape their future. Development cooperation should ultimately strengthen the relationship between citizen and public institutions. Instead, too often, it strengthens the relationship between governments and donors, or between implementing agencies and donors, or consultants and donors. The citizen frequently remains at the least powerful actor in the systems as supposedly designed for their benefit. That's why I believe that the future development cooperation in fragile contexts requires a more fundamental shift than the current reform discussions suggest. The humanitarian development peace nexus is important. Improved coordination is important as well. Better financing instruments are important, but none of these address the central issue. The central issue here, to me, is power. That is, who defines priority, who controls resources, who sets the terms for accountability, and who determines what success looks like. Until these questions are addressed, discussions about ownership risk becoming largely rhetorical. So what should change? First, democratic ownership should become the benchmark against which development cooperation is assessed, not whether donors consult citizens, but whether citizens exercise influence. Second, we should stop treating risk avoidance as a development strategy. Managing risk is, yes, necessary, but avoiding risk entirely is incompatible with working in fragile contexts. Third, humanitarian action should be designed with a political and economic transformation agenda in mind from the outset. The objective cannot be simply helping people survive crisis. It must also be about helping societies escape the conditions that it produces crisis. Fourth and last point is that development effectiveness monitoring should move beyond measuring technical compliance with principles and begin examining the actual power relations of development cooperation. Finally, we need greater honesty. Honesty about interests, honesty about incentives, and honesty about limits of external intervention. This is because ultimately the future of development cooperation in fragile contexts in fragile and conflict-affected contexts will not be determined by how much money we spend, but by whether we are willing to transfer meaningful authority to the people and the governments whose lives development cooperation is supposed to improve. I thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm really happy that you put such emphasis on power, because that is at the core, I think, of many of our conversations. For those who are thinking about this, I take your point completely about inclusion can feel just like a buzzword or a fuzzword. Or sometimes it's good just to go back to Einstein's ladder of participation, which is actually from 1969, and says a lot about what participation and power really need to look like. So thank you, Vitalis. Very, very powerful remarks and extremely helpful. Christopher, may I turn to you, please?
Thank you so much. I often ask myself, if I had, say, $100 million to allocate as aid to fragile country, how would I do it? Or how would you do it, right? This is not a hypothetical question. This is something that decision makers face constantly. So on what should that decision rest? And my answer is on ethics and on evidence. Why? Because aid is a finite resource. And because aid is finite, it must be allocated to do as much good as possible. That is a very utilitarian approach. It simply means you must do as much good as we can with the aid money.
Christoph, sorry to interrupt you. Could I ask you to put your camera on, please? We can't see you.
So sorry.
Thank you.
So once we accept that premise, the next step follows. Aid must be effective because ineffective aid is unethical. It consumes resources that could be otherwise save lives. If we spend aid on intervention that does not work, then we lose resources for intervention that might have worked. So how do you know whether aid is effective? through evidence. And evidence production has advanced rapidly over the past decade. And one tool that we have now to get more evidence is a country-level evidence synthesis. And I want to talk about that. So you're probably all familiar with systematic reviews. The aim of a systematic review is to collect all evidence that is available. So everything, not just bits and bits. Evidence across all sectors. And if we do it on country level, then it's all evidence within one country. So we collect all the evidence for one country across all 8 sectors. And then we introduce a threshold for quality, because we all know that, I don't know, 50, 60, 70% of all evaluations are really not good. They don't tell us anything, but there are many good evaluations. So we need those. So once we have that, once we have collected all the evidence across all 8 sectors for one country, we should have a pretty good idea of what works and what does not work, and that should be the basis of how to allocate aid. I have done that for 5 countries so far, for Mali, South Sudan, Afghanistan, Malawi, and Jordan, with various cooperation partners. I want to share with you the results only for the most fragile countries, which are Mali, South Sudan, Afghanistan. So for these 3 countries, we literally searched through thousands of evaluation and only kept the good ones. So we ended up with 330-something evaluation reports for these 3 countries. And then we organized these evaluations into sectors. 8 sectors. One big one is what we call core capacities. So in there goes 8 for state capacities, 8 for good governance, and 8 for stabilization. Then we have another basket for humanitarian aid, 1 for gender equality, 1 for economic development, 1 for rural development, 1 for education, and 1 for nutrition and health. So once we have that, that's all the evidence on a given country over the last 15 years across all 8 sectors, we can start looking at the results. We did, and are the results sobering? Yes, they are, but they're also robust. They're robust results. So we have to take them seriously, because that is what we know, right? So let me quickly walk you through what works and what does not work. It's probably not too surprising for you. Across all the countries, interventions improving health and basic education outcomes showed positive results. So health and basic education generally works, even in the most difficult situations as Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Mali. Just one example, so child and maternal health, mortality helps, midwifery training helps, antenatal care works, conditional cash transfers work, things like that. Education follows a similar pattern. Access to primary education for boys and girls does work most of the time. And the reason for this is probably relatively clear. Governments treat health and education as priorities, so there's a buy-in. And they're not too difficult to deliver, and they're not political. So on the top is health and education. Then the next level is what works somewhat, to some extent, is aid for livelihoods, food security, and resilience in rural regions. For example, community-level organizations can deliver aid to small infrastructure, stuff like irrigation channels, rural roads, energy access. All this can translate into improved livelihoods and coping mechanisms. Rural credit schemes work, cash transfers, social protection, village saving groups. So these things can work even in countries like Afghanistan and South Sudan. And interestingly, even subnational government capacity in these fields can be built up because it's subnational, right? And it's in sectors which are not politicized. So in these sectors, a little bit, some inroads can be made towards state capacities. Now, what does not work or poorly work is gender transformative programming does not work. There's simply no buy-in, and it's too difficult, and aid is not a strong enough lever. What works is basic services for women. That does work, but that's different from gender transformative, right? And then what does not work at all, and that's the most sobering result, is what I have just named core state capacities. And that's also hard to find and to accept. But I think it's very robust, right? So stabilization, aid for stabilization does not work. Aid for government capacity building at the central level does not work. Aid for good governance interventions does not work. These things are at the heart of Western state building. These aim directly at what makes state fragile. And yet, across all these contexts, across more than 15 years, they have consistently failed. So we cannot build capacity of a fragile state while it's fragile through aid. We cannot promote democracy in such a state while it's fragile or at war. We may be able to help a little bit with the mechanics of elections, but that does not produce political participation or accountability, right? And lastly, stabilization does also not work. So we cannot reduce violence by aid interventions, and we cannot buy more legitimacy for the government by aid interventions, which is, in my understanding, is what stabilization is: reducing conflict, increasing legitimacy. The reason for this are structural. It's the link to political economy. We can talk about the reasons for this in the Q&A. I'll leave it for now. So what does this mean? It means that we should probably invest where the probability of success is high, and we should not invest where the probability of failure is high. Which also means that needs alone cannot drive allocation, because needs are everywhere and is so high, right? We must always also factor in the probability of success when we make aid allocations, which means we should prioritize basic health, basic education, food security, and livelihoods. And we should deprioritize good governance, democracy promotion, stabilization, gender transformative programming. Now, I'm completely aware that this is a very bitter pill for many, for all of us, right? Because most aid practitioners and many people invested in this field, they are driven by a genuine desire to be transformational, right? We want to use aid to remove barriers and set countries on a path towards stability. So we may call this it's just a band-aid, what I'm advocating for, right? It's not transformation, it's a band-aid. But there's two buts. The first one is I do think that band-aids are not only bad. Band-aids can prevent worse outcomes. They are cost-effective. They do alleviate real suffering. And most importantly, they can preserve opportunities for a later, better time. If we don't do anything, it gets worse. If we do something, we can alleviate suffering. And the other part is also important. This does not mean that we have to accept that fragile states are just permanently stuck in fragility traps. We know that some states have exited fragility. Not many, that's true. It's very, very difficult. But some did. And that's actually a research project, another one. And I can talk more about it if there's interest in the Q&A. But what we see is that fragility exits are always driven by endogenous processes. So, I don't know, 90% of these exits are driven by endogenous processes that create new political settlements. It's all about these political settlements, which can allow a state to move forward. Which means, for me, we should be much better at spotting these windows of opportunities, because there are windows of opportunity in countries. They're endogenously induced, but then there is a window of opportunity. We should get better at spotting these and then act decisively when there is such a chance. And I do think we can do this, and I'm happy to talk more about it. But I'm also very aware of the time, and that's why I'm stopping here, and I look forward to questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christoph. And if you have any links to those resources you mentioned, please do put them into the chat. That would be great. Thank you. Without further ado, Ranil, let me bring you in, because I know that you have some limited time today. Please.
Thanks, Peter. I know everyone's probably also tired of just hearing from people and wanted to ask some questions, so I will be as brief as I can be. So I want to take a different tack to most of the other speakers and talk a little bit about this from a donor's perspective of how working in fragile contexts typically it can exacerbate or rather amplify lots of the worst habits donors have about how they operate. And thinking about working effectively in a fragile context requires that donors sort of do a lot of, I think, frankly, navel-gazing and looking internally at their own decision-making processes, priorities, and their own sort of approaches, because I think it makes all of the sorts of decisions donors have to make routinely more difficult, and it also makes it easier for them, I think, to just sort of lapse into sort of fairly ineffective, fairly sort of low, not very controversial, but sort of low impact ways of working. So I'm going to sort of structure a lot of my comments around sort of what do donors need to know about how they want to operate and how they are comfortable thinking with sort of taking on risk and working through uncertainty, because generally, actually, aid effectiveness is not rocket science. It depends on basically three things. It depends on where you spend, on what, and really sort of in terms of your achievement of change when, and how you do it. And I mean, each of those things has a huge literature around sort of how you should choose where to spend given a set of objectives, and which specific priorities and topics matter the most, and blah, blah, blah. But it's really, conceptually, it's quite a simple idea. You should spend in the places where you can have the biggest effect on the things that have the biggest welfare impact over the time frame that makes the biggest difference to the sort of long-term welfare of the population you're working with. And you should do it in the way that has the greatest impact, given the resources that you have available. So conceptually, it's not very difficult. However, working in fragile and context-affected settings makes all of those questions a lot harder to answer. And even in non-fragile contexts, I think most donors are quite woolly. They don't think about those questions in a very precise, very structured way. And and in fragile context, that sort of woolliness, that sort of lack of clear analytical basis for and to respond to those questions is much more leads to much worse outcomes. So taking them in turn, right? Sort of the first thing is that in fragile contexts, there's a fairly subtle question about the objectives that we're trying to achieve that donors need to ask themselves and to have a good answer for. So one way you could think about why we work in fragile and conflict-affected contexts is that we are trying to basically respond to the same sorts of objectives that we're trying to respond to everywhere in lots of other developing countries, sort of poverty, human development, be that education or health or whatever it is, or growth, and so on. And we are working in fragile and conflict-affected states because that's where those problems are now most concentrated and will be even more so concentrated in the future. So that's one way of thinking about what our objectives are. The other way of thinking about our objectives is that we care specifically about places that are affected by fragility or conflict, and we want to work in those places as a way of helping them get out of this fragility trap, even if the reason we want to get them out of that fragility trap is the same sorts of things: poverty, learning, healthcare, etc., and so forth. Now, the reason I make that distinction is that it actually has quite a profound difference to sort of where you should spend. If you care about the global level problem of poverty or human development or whatever it is, then it's not necessarily the case that you would spend more in fragile and conflict-affected states, because you may find that your level of effectiveness is so much higher in non-fragile states that even though it's a smaller proportion of the overall problem, it still makes more sense to spend in those places. But if you have a specific interest in combating fragility or working for people affected by fragility, then that leads to a very different aid allocation an aid allocation decision. And so it's at this first basic level that donors start to fall down. They haven't really sort of very carefully thought to themselves, why are we working on all of these things? The second thing is that the question of what to do and over what time horizon is also sort of, we're really fuzzy about this. So we've talked a little bit about the sort of, IFAT, I think, raised the sort of, it's not exactly a trade-off, but the question of whether we care about immediate humanitarian need or whether we care about sort of long-term state capacity building or changing a long-term equilibrium. So to some extent, there's a trade-off. There's also a possibility that you can work in ways that make immediate impact, in ways that are at least consistent with better long-term outcomes. You can also work in ways that address immediate impact that have absolutely make no difference to the long-term equilibrium or actually make it worse. And so we need to have a very, very careful idea about both of those problems, the immediate need and the long-term outcome that we're trying to achieve, and a clear theory about how does what we're working on affect each of them in different ways. And then that should be absolutely central to how we start designing our portfolios. And again, it's not really obvious that most donors, most of the time, thinking that way. Then the third area that I mentioned was sort of this question about how. And in fragile and conflict-affected states, you have much weaker evidence of how you should act in order to have an impact. So part of this evidence part of the lack of evidence that we have is really conceptual. So the constraints to better learning outcomes in, say, Zambia and Somalia are likely to be very different. So a program that we have very, very good evidence for in non-fragile states may have absolutely no impact in some fragile states because the relevant constraint that that program addresses is just not the binding one in the fragile context. So that's one way in which our evidence base can be inadequate for working effectively in fragile states. But the other way is also just about implementation. So across all countries, implementation matters to a first, it's a first order issue of effectiveness. Can you actually find the partners and the implementers and the people who can deliver a program effectively and in the way that sort of maximizes its impact and its cost effectiveness? That can be much harder in fragile and conflict-affected states, but not universally so. In some fragile states, you have a really well-developed local system of delivery, and it's really important, I think, actually, to be really super clear about what capabilities exist for achieving what in different kinds of states. So I know, for example, in Myanmar, there is a really effective delivery system at the local level run by local Myanmar organizations that would put to shame the organizations in a lot of other contexts. And so there's a fourth area about, a third area, I should say, about how we act that I think donors need to be really careful about when they're engaging in fragile states. And that is, we have this tendency to assume that poor social outcomes are a side effect of fragility or whatever the dynamic is that drives fragility. And that's not necessarily true. They could be absolutely central to the political equilibrium in a place, right? It could be that the political equilibrium in a fragile country depends on there being poverty or restricted access to food, or where access to healthcare is sort of part of what is dished out as a reward for political compliance or whatever. And that is potentially a little bit true in non-fragile states as well, but it's a much more immediate and pressing concern in fragile contexts. So again, sort of a big chunk of how donors need to operate in these places really requires that they have they do a lot of thinking about what they believe about how they should act to achieve specific goals, which specific goals, and how much they're willing to take on risk, work through uncertainty, and consistently, constantly monitor and evaluate and check on how their programs are working, not just from an impact perspective, but just are the sort of mechanical things that we were meant to do, like get sort of people out to this area, are they happening? And are the services being delivered? Now, the last thing I just wanted to say here is that last point I made about the political equilibrium may well be sort of built in part on the poor outcomes of the people who we're trying to support. It also brings us to this sort of question of localization and how we work with local partners. Now, I actually think the localization is far more complex than most of us are willing to admit. Who is the partner in any country? Development is an inherently contested process. There's always, almost always, there will be winners and losers. And in a fragile state, almost by definition, there is an incredibly strong contestation over what the process of change in that country should look like. So it is basically impossible to say that you are working with the country as a partner, right? That's just not a realistic statement. There's very little that will not be contested. So we have to be very, very clear with ourselves about who within the country we want to work with, for what objective, and who we are willing not to work with, and who we are willing to see lose out because of that. And that's why actually, so I think someone previously said that there's a, one of the principles we should apply is do no harm. I would actually disagree with that, because from a philosophical perspective, I mean, do no harm doesn't make sense even in the medical profession. You would never do surgery if you wanted to do no harm. But it's much more profound in a development perspective. There are winners, relatively, certainly, but also in absolute terms very often. There are winners and losers to almost any development intervention. So for a donor to operate effectively in a fragile state, on a fragile context, it has to be very clear to itself what kinds of harm are we willing to at least take a risk of, or to whom. In very many cases, we actually want to actively do harm to some groups who are in power and who are holding, who are whatever, helping, who are engaged actively in conflict, or who are keeping certain groups of the population without access to sort of services or whatever. We want to reduce their grip on power. That is a harm to them. And for donors to be effective in this sort of context, they have to have a great deal of self-knowledge about what political costs they're willing to bear, and what political costs they're willing to impose on other people. So I'll stop there, but the general point I just want to make is that working in fragile context is difficult, partly because of the fragile context, but very much because of how donors operate and the way in which we think. And I think to do this more effectively, we need to have a lot more honesty in our own internal conversations about what we're trying to achieve and how.
Thank you so much, Randall. And that word honesty came up before also as something which is sorely needed right now, because there is that perception that somehow we will find a kind of technocratic solution. But, you know, all the reasons that you and other speakers have just raised, circumstances are different, contexts are different, groups are different, needs are different. And, you know, the short answers that researchers often give is, well, it's complex. Well, it is complex. But at the same time, there's clearly a need to try to find a way through that complexity, which I think many, you just now, Randall, and others have also helped us to try to navigate these dilemmas. So, Randall, I know that you have to leave now, but thank you so much for participating. You won't get the chance to answer some of the questions, but you know, you may come back later and share some more insights with us. So, thanks a lot for that, for joining us. Thank you. For those of us who are still here and those who are still online, thank you to everyone who's stayed. We have now a few questions in the chat, and actually I saw that Habib, you kindly actually responded to one of them, but let's go through a few of them, and some of them are probably a bit more specific to some of our individual speakers, whereas others perhaps could be responded to by different speakers. So I'll just start at the top, and just to say from Vidya, we've had actually two questions, which I'll just quickly summarize. The first is, given we've heard aid can support basic services, which is known to have direct poverty reducing impacts, but less success in state building and stabilization, is the implication that donors should be placing greater emphasis on poverty reduction when defining aid effectiveness in fragile conflict affected states? So that's the first question. And then a specific question to Christoph. Much of what you presented, Vidya, suggests focusing on what works on average. Does the evidence synthesis that you carried out point to what types of aid modalities, service delivery channels, or interventions are particularly effective at reaching those furthest behind? So Christoph, if you can hold that one. The questions are in the Q&A if you want to refer back to them. Then also Naimat asked two questions, which I'll just share. One is specifically, I think, Habib, perhaps I'll come to you for it. In a volatile context like Afghanistan, what does effective, realistic monitoring and evaluation look like when traditional frameworks fail? And also the bigger question of how can we shift the paradigm so that national partners are treated as co-designers of aid strategies rather than just ground level implementers, and why are their voices still being excluded at the design and allocation stage? So I think that really comes to a lot of the points that were raised around, why inclusion is not actually achieved very often. We also have a question which relates to something which was discussed about how may fragile countries mobilize resources domestically at the time of significant aid cuts? Are there opportunities, for example, through using taxation more efficiently? Is it realistic to assume that fragile and conflict-affected contexts are able to do that? And how could aid be deployed to build domestic resource mobilization efforts? And then we also had a question from Lizzie, which is, again, speaking to something that came up quite a lot, is despite the commitment to the humanitarian development nexus in many contexts, humanitarian delivery still comes at the expense of building longer-term political settlements. So how do you shift some of these protracted crises towards broader and more stable political settlements, even at a time when global aid reductions are making this ever more challenging, even though it is important? And the last question, which is from Aurelian, is and something I'm hoping that one of you will be able to respond to, how do you explain the direction of the newly published World Bank Fragility, Conflict and Violence Strategy, which seems to be contrary to most of the lessons which have been collectively presented? So we've got quite a lot there to engage with, and I think perhaps I can start with maybe Habib. I can come to you first, and then Christoph, I can come to you after, and then we'll go around and we hopefully will get some responses. So Habib, over to you first.
Well, thank you, Peter. I think I'll start with the question of the national actors and NGOs that was particularly asked in contexts like Afghanistan. As I mentioned before, we believe in the G7+ that the national actors and national systems are more effective in aid delivery for a very simplistic reason. National actors know better than anyone else what the priorities are, what should be the modalities, and how intervention can be effective. I'm sure that there is enough empirical evidence to prove that. Secondly, national systems and national actors could enhance the efficiency of aid delivery, whether that is humanitarian or development. Now, I have to make a little bit of difference here. Being an intergovernmental organization, the G7+ have always advocated for a greater trust in the national systems, national state systems, because we believe that state is the ultimate bearer of the responsibility of, the service delivery. But of course, we have contexts where we don't have, we are having de facto authorities or where there is no state present, like in many crisis situations like Sudan. Of course, that is out of question. But in the long run, we definitely have to think how we can transform and how we can have that transition. Because one of the things that we have witnessed in countries like Afghanistan in the past, or Iraq or other countries, when you rely pretty much on non-state actors, you enter into a perpetual cycle of dependency, which makes even aid delivery more expensive. The second part of the question is very important on the monitoring framework. We also believe that we have to be, when we say we, I refer to the international community, we have to be humble enough to understand the contextual realities of each country. One of the challenges that we always face in aid management is that we have to make sure that the monitoring framework is in line with what the international community or the donor, systems require us to do. That has been quite challenging because you cannot do that for a very simplistic reason. Again, contexts are different, and then you try to use the same blueprint everywhere. So back to my first point, that if we rely on national systems, we also have to give a little bit of flexibility and in understanding what is an impact that will be produced there, or what impact is needed there, because again, priorities are different from countries to countries. So I hope I have answered this question. I also wanted to just maybe, if you allow me, Peter, I wanted to ask or tackle the question about the support to state building and also service delivery. I came across a research that also points out that aid is more effective when it's based, or when it's focusing on service delivery rather than state building. We have to make a little bit difference here. The so-called state building efforts by donors are not really state building efforts. We think that merely providing technical assistance or advisors that would be that will have to be seated in certain ministries for a certain period, and then we expect them to transform the whole system. That does not simply function. We have to be patient. From the perspective of the G7+, we believe that state building assistance to state building should be more systematic. It should focus on preparing the next generation of leaders, the next generation of the institutions to take the responsibility. I'll give you a very simple example, again, from the lessons in Afghanistan. We did a study at that time, back in 2012 or 11, where we counted the amount of technical assistance that was spent, which was more than $1.something billion. And the technical assistance would include advisors that would be seated in many ministries. And then we tally it with the investment or with the budget to the higher education. We came to a conclusion that within 5 years, if even quarter of what had been spent on the so-called international assistance, technical assistance, if that had been allocated to the higher education in terms of modernizing it or in terms of providing scholarships, we could have generated a cadre of very well-equipped, young, talented professionals who could take forward and who could become, who could be absorbed into the public sector that could have delivered the services. So I do hope that, this is also my question, or maybe a challenge to the academia here. If we can make that distinction, what really we mean by when we talk about state building, assistance. So I'll stop here. And the third question on domestic revenue, I don't want to repeat it. I shared my thoughts on the chat. Okay. Yeah, over to you, please.
Thank you, Habib. Really, really great responses. Thank you. I do want to hear from all of our speakers on some of those questions which have been shared. So perhaps I can come to Christoph, to you now, and then to Vitalis, to come to you. And then, Rachel, I want to make sure also that we get probably some final word from you to round out the webinar. But Christoph, over to you first.
Thank you. If I understood you correctly, then the question was, my remarks were on aid effectiveness on average, but how to reach the most marginalized people, right? So first of all, another question was, do we need to prioritize poverty reduction? My clear answer is yes. Poverty reduction in these countries is really essential, and that's part of the answer, right? It is essential for ethical reasons. It is also essential because it is one of the sectors where there's a high probability that at least something can be done, whereas in other sectors, it will be futile, because we cannot do, as I said, without a political settlement. Most of the things we want to do will not work in these countries, right? We cannot do state building initiatives in South Sudan. It just doesn't work. Then more specifically, I think this is really context dependent, and we should also have a context dependent answer, because I don't know who the most marginalized groups are across the globe. That would have been an answer depending on what country we're talking about. But I do think there's two things to it. One is simply targeting, right? Go to those regions where groups are marginalized, find those groups who are marginalized, find those groups who think they're marginalized, and then make an effort that aid actually goes there, which means aid has to be very transparent and also not delivered through national systems, because in these countries, national systems tend not to be impartial. They're partial. They always go to the cousin of the cousin, right? And the other thing is just apply the same principles to make aid effective. So if you have the targeting right, then we also have to make aid effective. And in these countries, again, it's a very modest. I don't think we should have these hugely ambitious programs in place. What we should do is modest programs, community-led programs, community-driven programs, with a lot of buy-in from the local communities. Not do the big things, because they will be always targeting for corruption. And also, if I may add one last thing, I do think in these contexts, aid should be relieved from the 1,000 things that we think aid should do. And, aid should be do this and this and this and this, and all at the same point. In a context like Afghanistan or Mali or South Sudan, aid should be about poverty reduction. And if we can do poverty reduction without doing harm, that's actually great. But what we have seen in these places all over time, that we are pretty good at, not pretty good, we are okay-ish at delivering aid. But there's a huge risk that aid actually exacerbates the cleavages. Because if the system is, if the people perceive the system to be corrupt, then even if they get aid, the perception will always be that the other ethnic group gets more aid. And then, yes, there is some marginal benefit in we deliver some basic services, but there's also harm, because we have increased perception of inequality, and this exacerbates conflict. So for me, it's a good enough goal to deliver basic services without exacerbating the conflicts on the ground. And for this to achieve, we should relieve, not everywhere, but in these contexts we're talking about, we should relieve aid of all the other things that we hope it should do, and focus on a few very basic things. Thank you.
Thank you, Christoph. Thanks. Vitalis, if I can turn to you and then to Rachel. We have about 4 minutes remaining. So Vitalis, let me come to you, and then we'll come to Rachel for some final thoughts. There's also just a question in the chat which related to the fragmentation across across the sector-specific aid architecture, and are there more opportunities not only for donor implementing organizations to coordinate, but also bringing together a much more diverse array of actors and across sectors from the beginning within a given country context. So I suspect that this may speak to some of the things, Vitalis, that you're also thinking about.
No, thanks. Let me first react to some of the comments the speaker just raised. I think on the issue of poverty reduction, I think the approach needs to change a bit, or shift a bit, from being about managing people in the crisis, in the conflict context, to really making them stakeholders, so that the intervention is not about continued implementation of projects or initiatives, but really how do you strengthen ownership, participation and stakeholding of groupings, of communities in that agenda. And I think that's where the issue of democratic ownership I was raising comes about. And that in that regard, the issue of priority setting really becomes the basis under which interventions takes place. Otherwise, if it's something that's just chipped in, become from abroad to the community, doesn't work. The second point I wanted to raise is on the DRM question. Indeed, I think that, I understood the definition of when do you call a country fragile, but one of the main components of it is really the ability of the state to collect taxes and spend. And I think part of ODA intervention or aid intervention should be able to strengthen that capacity of governments to be able to collect taxes and be able to spend effectively. And in that regard, I think areas that need attention in the fragile context is also about how we strengthen their public finance management system. And if you look at what happened in Rwanda and what there is now, the Rwanda Revenue Authority is one of the strongest, and it's based on the support that that government received from development partners to strengthen its capacity to be able to mobilize and be able to really be able to collect resources and spend them effectively. Now, on the issue of, I mean, fragmentation is one of the major concerns, especially if it is a glaring idea that keeps existing in the internet. I think we try to discourage parallel processes. We try to discourage scenarios where there are very many actors that are not necessarily contributing to the same cause. I think if the national government and the community have identified priorities, it is really the onus on development partners, whether CSOs or government or official donors, to align with the priorities of the community and with the priorities of the government, instead of doing what they want on their own. Thanks.
Thank you, Vitalis, and thanks also for picking up that suddenly posed last question as well. Much appreciated. Rachel, I'm going to give you the last word. This has been an amazing conversation. Lots of people have really appreciated it in the chat. I see also you're off your phone and onto your laptop, which is great.
Yeah.
So let's give you the final few thoughts. Really pick up anything that you would like to. Thanks.
Sure. So I'm, really thankful to my fellow panelists for answering all the questions. And I wanted to actually come back to a point that was brought up in several ways among the different starting interventions. And it's sort of the point of the webinar to think about what is the evidence that we should be, what is the most relevant evidence for researchers and practitioners and policymakers in this area. And so I wanted to make 3 brief points about that, about the nature of evidence here. I think, one point that's been really clear to me in the discussion is that there is really a diverse array of different types of evidence. I spent quite a lot of time with development economists, and development economists for a very long time have thought of impact evaluations and experiments as really the gold standard in thinking about what works. And yes, we can learn a lot from that sort of evidence, but I think as the interventions have shown, there's all sorts of other evidence that's important in these discussions, including, and I really like Christoph's work in this area, drawing on systematic reviews to aggregate evidence across multiple evaluations. But the second point is, I think there is still quite a ways to go in terms of learning in a contextually relevant way from the evidence. So how do we draw lessons from one country to another, from one context to another? When we think about post-conflict reconstruction, we often talk about post-conflict reconstruction, but in fact, in some contexts, it's constructing institutions where they didn't previously exist. And these are really different projects. And I think we often have a lot of hand-waving about how context matters. I do this myself in some of my work. I have done it, but I think we need to be much more systematic about precisely how context matters and how we can learn from particular experiences elsewhere. And then the third point that strikes me is that I think we also have to be very careful as people working in this area not to place too much emphasis on quantitative measures of impact, and to be very careful in how we read the evidence, right? So the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. We know this, but it's, I think, important to remember that when we think about the evidence on what works and what on aid effectiveness in fragile contexts. So we're working on these areas in K4DD at the University of Birmingham and GSDRC, and it's been really a pleasure to engage in this conversation with all of you.
Great, thank you so much, Rachel. I love that little quote. It's not the the evidence of absence, but the absence of the evidence. I mean, just understanding that distinction between those two things is a really valuable takeaway, actually. Thank you for sharing that. So we've come to the end. Thank you to all of those who have joined us today. This recording will be made available. And I think hopefully those who have joined us today have enjoyed it. Those who will listen to it later will also find it extremely useful. With huge thanks to Ranil, Christoph, Vitalis, Habib, Ifat, and Rachel, to you as well. Ben, my IDS colleague, for helping us organize this and bring it all together and managing many things in the background. And to all of you who've joined, thank you so much for joining this K4DD webinar. And please watch out on our website and other channels for more information, for more things to come. Do get in touch with us if you have any questions and follow-up comments. Thank you so much. And thanks again to our amazing speakers.